the European Union worked out. They took shale gas numbers because they're very concerned about the land consumption, the land use issue. And they took shale gas numbers based on actual production history, and they used Quicksilver Resources, which I grew up with the CEO and chairman of Quicksilver Resources. They're friends. They live in Fort Worth. And they used their numbers for shale gas wells, and then they compared it. And what they did was they took a 3-acre pad site in Pennsylvania. That's the average size of a pad site in Pennsylvania, 3 acres. And they compared shale gas production and how much electricity you could generate off that 3 acres. And then they compared it to if you put a solar panels, covered 3 acres in solar panels. And what they found was that shale gas would produce more electricity in the first couple of years. It beat solar, hands down. But by year 10, the shale was over, completely over. And the solar panels went on, they said they estimated only 20 years, but they said not all panels have gone bad after 20 years, but they were trying to be conservative. And they found that the solar panels actually over time generated more electricity than shale gas.
Yes.
And that's in a European Union report, and I'd be happy to provide the link. In fact, that's on Energy Policy Forum. I did a post on that, and I think I put the link at the bottom of the post if you want to look it up. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I thought that was quite interesting. Yes?
All right. What I would like to say is this: by observing all the points that are presented to us, that this is a big scam in the financial system. You know, they go, they give this big speech, and they promise so much, but in the end, they give basically nothing. It's almost like, by the way the thing builds up, the way you described, it is like a Ponzi scheme, if you think about it.
Well, you know, in that New York Times article that I was involved in, it was industry insiders that called it the Ponzi scheme. It was people in the oil and gas business in those emails, and you can go pull them in the document reader to that article. It was oil and gas people who called it the Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, it's evident, no question. But there's something more sinister behind this, because I've been observing all kinds of stuff is being doing against the people around the world, like especially genetically modified foods. You know, when it comes to the big promise, they're going to feed the world and everything else, but in the end, they're poisoning everybody. They're poisoning all the ecosystems and killing all the wildlife in the process. And this is all pretty much the same thing from what I've been observing, from everything I've been reading. They're just destroying the ecosystem. And we all lose in the end. I don't understand why this is being promoted so emphatically, you know. It blows my mind.
I think it's a very powerful industry, and they recognize that they have a finite product. I mean, let's face it, the oil and gas industry is the most powerful thing on the planet. It's much more powerful than any government of any country.
Yeah, I understand.
So, in fact, ExxonMobil now says we are not a citizen of any country. We are a land unto ourselves, basically. They actually said that. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but they said, we don't consider ourselves a citizen of any country.
Wow.
Well, if you're not a citizen of any country, then you probably feel zero responsibility at the end of the day to anybody. And especially if you're hiding behind the auspices of a giant corporation. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The first question is, and I'm sorry it's an environmental one, but I think you probably answer it. You talked about the cleanup of pad sites. Could you help me understand what needs to be cleaned up, like when a site is, or well is done?
Sure. Yeah. If you could completely reclaim a pad site or remediate a pad site, you would go in and you would just remove any evidence that the well had ever been there. You would plug it, it would be removed, all the tanks would be gone, the land would have to be cleaned up, it would have to be, you know, you've seen remediation of brown fields, for instance, where they come in and they have to excavate the soil and so forth, and they have to do testing for a number of years. It's very, very expensive to do indeed. And so, of course, these companies are not going to want to engage in that, but somebody's going to have to engage in it at some point.
So is there contamination of the soil?
There can be. That's what I was stating. Every single one of these pad sites has the potential to be a Superfund site. because of the chemicals that they use in the hydraulic fracture stimulation.
Okay.
We've had 2 studies done in New Brunswick just recently, one by a Professor Lapierre, I think his name was, from Munston,
Right.
who gave us a lot of information, some of it probably factual. We've had a study done by our public health officer
Right.
for the province, and however, none of these seem to have the information that you have available. Have you had the opportunity, have you been asked to talk to any of these people? And have they attended the meetings? I do see our local representative here tonight, but I think it was very well reflected in today's paper, and I think it was in the editorial. It said the biggest problem in New Brunswick is government trust. You can't trust them. And I see you have a whole different problem in Texas, but it started, I think, they told us that George Bush was the first thing he did when he was
Let's
in there.
not talk about that.
Comparing the ills to the goods in the shale gas, it's quite clear that the ills far outweigh the goods. I was reading a paper this week that Herman Daly wrote, which he looks at the entire economy with the GDP and so on, the real GDP as opposed to the financial GDP. I'd like you to discuss a little bit about that idea that the ills in our entire economy now outweigh the goods, as it were, and that it seems to me that the shale gas operates as a very clear analogy to the disintegration of the entire capitalist economy, as it were.
It's quite a statement. You know, from my perspective, again, as I stated before, I think that shale is a very good example of some of the problems in the financial markets globally. There's too much. We need financial reform. There's no doubt about it. There's too much off-balance sheet financing. You can't get a good picture of these companies any longer. You know, everyone was caught off guard by the $1.5 billion in unaccounted. That was all off-balance sheet financing, by the way, at Chesapeake. The analysts that cover the stock, they knew nothing about it. And you can't get a good picture of a company when you're not allowed to see the financials. And these are publicly traded companies. That's one aspect of financial reform that needs to be dealt with. Another aspect, to my mind, that needs to be dealt with, and that's perhaps even more problematic, is these investment banks, because their business model is predatory now. They make money, they make fees. It used to be that investment banks, you worked with your client and you tried to help them. It was a partnership type relationship. That's not the case anymore. They're predators now. And they make fees on the way up with a company, or they'll make fees on the way down. Now, I was stating this last night. This is my personal opinion, but I can tell you, there is no way on this planet, there's no way on this planet that those investment bankers at Goldman, Barcap, that's Barclays Capital, by the way, Jeffries and so forth, that they did not know what was going to happen to the price of natural gas. They are the architects of a lot of this off-balance sheet financing. They got companies like Chesapeake and others to enter into what they call volumetric production payments, which I won't go into all of that, but this is all off-balance sheet financing. They have production targets that they make these companies meet, and if they don't meet them, then the analysts downgrade the stocks. I do a great if you don't mind me saying that, I mean, I do a presentation. I don't know if you think it was great, but I think it's interesting on this very thing where I went in and I took Chesapeake as the example just because Chesapeake was having a lot of financial problems at the time. And I looked at, I want to see, okay, we're finding out all these revelations of Chesapeake, and I want to see what the analysts are rating Chesapeake to you and I as average Joe investor. So I went in and I looked, who are their biggest investment banks? Well, it's you know, the same old, the usual suspects, as we would say in the States. It's Goldman, it's Barclays Capital, it's Royal Bank of Scotland, it's Jeffries. And then I wanted to see, I said, okay, here are your investment banks. You are the boys making the most money. Now I want to see what you're telling the average investor about Chesapeake. Raging buy. Buy Chesapeake, buy Chesapeake. We have a buy on Chesapeake. Then I went over and I looked at the banks and the investment firms that weren't making fees off Chesapeake, and they had get out as fast as you can. It can't be both. There's a definite conflict of interest. And as long as these banks aren't reformed, you know, I was on the advisory committee for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and they came out with a paper back, I think it was in March, and Richard Fisher has called for breaking up. He calls them too big to fail. And he said, if you're too big to fail, you're too big, and you need to be broken up. And he's quite right. And until we do something about these banks, it is, in my opinion, we're going to continue to see these boom and bust cycles on accelerated scales such as we've seen over the last 15 or 20 years, because the banks, it's in their interest to create such boom and bust. They're going to make money on the way up, and they're going to make money on the way down, and then they're going to look for the next sucker, victim, whatever you want to call them, and then they're going to make money on the way up and make money on the way down. And that's exactly what's happened. If you look at what's happened with these banks, and now I'm talking about banks too much, I'm sorry, but that's exactly what's happened since the economic meltdown. They're making tons of money. So I'm sorry, I got on my soapbox. I think it was 250 million to 400 million. Does that sound right? Does that sound about right? Yeah. And the first thing I said, well, what are they basing it on? You know, and so, yeah, well, and trust me, it's hard to get that information out of them. You have to be like a terrier with a sock in its mouth. Don't give up. Yeah, but you can get it eventually. I mean, it should be public information. But those are very important questions to ask. And then I would ask, what has been your track record in other plays? You've got SWIN up here. They have a track record. Southwestern does. I just showed you what they were claiming in investor presentations, and all of this is documented. I didn't make this up. It's all documented. And they're claiming 2.4 average well in the Fayetteville, when in actual fact it's 1. So I would ask them that as well. I hope that answered your question. Okay, good. Yes?
Hi. I would just like you to touch on the economic losses that each individual person who lives here in New Brunswick would have if their land or land near them gets fracked. What can happen to their property values, and so on and so forth. And what has happened in your area with people who've...
Okay, there hasn't been a whole lot of work done on this yet, and I wish that someone would do this. I keep asking people, in every university I speak at, I say, please, somebody pick this up. So I can only kind of give you a few studies and some anecdotal evidence, okay? As far as the studies, in my neck of the woods, they did have a company go in and look at the property values near gas drilling pad sites, and they determined that if you lived within, I think it was a mile of a gas drilling pad site, you could knock 15% off your property value instantly. Now, I personally think that's a very conservative figure, but it was a study done in Texas. And to even say 15% was a pretty big deal, because you just don't talk against the oil and gas industry in Texas typically. The other thing is, I think it's nationwide, isn't it? And they've now stated that they will not offer coverage, insurance coverage, for if you allow fracking on your land. That, I think, is going to become a very big deal. Now, it's not such a big deal for us in Texas because we're set up a little bit differently, but in the Northeast, I think that's going to become a very big deal indeed. Anyway, so that. Now, anecdotally, near me, there is a couple named Tim and Christine Ruggiero. You might have heard of them, I don't know, but they've become kind of famous because of this. They own some property, and it's not very far from where I live. They're probably about a 30-minute drive from me, a bit north, but still in that pad site area that you saw. And Aruba Petroleum was the operator there, and it was so tragic. I mean, Aruba just made one mistake after another. It was like spill after air emission. You know, TCEQ was out there all the time. I think they ate with the Ruggieros. I mean, literally, I think they ate lunch and dinner with them because they were just out there monitoring. It was just a disaster. Now, that's a bit unusual, okay? These companies, not every pad site is a total disaster, but this one was. The Ruggieros paid $275,000 for their house, roughly thereabouts. And then it was appraised like 2 years later after all of this had happened, and the house was worth $76,000. Aruba ended up buying the property from them, and Tim and Christine have moved. I don't know what they were paid for the property because they have a non-disclosure agreement. And of course, as you know, that's what these companies do. They'll buy you out, but then you can't ever talk about it. So that's an anecdotal bit of evidence. And that's about all I know at this point in the game on insurance, mortgages, and property values. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Is the shale gas play an investment banker play or a gas play?
I don't think it's a gas play. I think it was drilling for dollars in the capital markets. I think these companies, and that's why I think Chesapeake is like the poster child of this, because Chesapeake is so aggressive financially. They're known for it. Aubrey McClendon's a total braggart, and I'm not speaking out of school here. I would say the same thing if he was standing right here on the stage with me. He's a complete braggart, and he's very, very aggressive financially. He's always been that way. It's very interesting to me because when I started working on a lot of this, I pulled pages and pages of analyst call transcripts going back to about 2006, and I read every single quarter for numerous companies all the way to present day. And Chesapeake was the first one, and they were like, we can get you to loan us a whole lot of money, can't we? And then we can do a land grab. And that's what that quote I gave you where he was talking about, why do I even need to drill for gas? I make way more money off doing that. And what was interesting was when you went through these call transcripts, I could see the other companies watching Chesapeake by what they were saying to the financial analysts. You could begin to see a pattern. Like Range Resources is the one that really jumped out at me. I know John Pinkerton too. He lives in Fort Worth, just around the corner from where I used to live. Anyway, they were watching Chesapeake, and they were kind of dipping their toe in the water and thinking, if this is going to work for Chesapeake, I'm definitely going to jump in right behind them. And boy, they really started tumbling in after them, because what they figured out was we don't really need to drill very much in the overall scheme of things. We talk about 17,000 wells now in the Barnett, and that sounds like a whole lot of wells, and it is. But if you look at the amount of land that these companies have leased throughout the United States, it's a pittance. The Barnett was supposed to be, it was touted that they were going to drill 80,000 wells in the Barnett total. They drilled about 17,000. But they originally, they always said, we're going to drill 80,000 wells and you all are going to be rich. So you could see this happening, and what they've done, in fact, there was a great Bloomberg, I think it was Bloomberg, it might have been Wall Street Journal headline in January. And what they do is they go in and they lease up a whole lot of land for a very little money. And in this case, the example I'm going to give you, it was Hunt Oil, which is out of Dallas. It's Ray Hunt. You remember the Hunt brothers in the silver market in the 70s? Same guy. Imagine that. So it's Hunt Oil, and they go into Ohio and they're paying the farmers $500 an acre. And then they put together this whole leasehold thing. What they do is they put together a big lease acreage, they drill a couple of wells, and then they announce the high IP. You remember? I talked about the initial potential. They said, oh my God, we've hit monster wells. This is just great. And then they flip them to another company, and guess who helps with the flipping? Yep, Goldman Sachs, Barcap, Jeffries, for a fee. And they flip them to another company. And Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal, I can't remember which one it was, the headline was, shale gas bubble on untested fields. Essentially, there was a little bit more to it, but that was essentially it. So do you see where I'm going with this? I mean, yeah, it's the mainstream financial press is calling it a bubble, and they're saying, this is crazy. You don't pay $25,000 an acre for all this acreage that's untested. We have no idea whether the resource is really there. They've been able to play that game, and they played it through the auspices of the investment banks. I mean, I can tell you right now, I heard the part about, will the U.S. government put the investment bankers in jail, and the answer to that is no. That is the new industry playbook. They're using it in the Marcellus as well, and what they're trying to do is say, oh, come on, just let us go into the southern tier in New York, because they really want us down there, and let us go in and drill a few wells in New Brunswick. Once they're in here, they're in here. Yeah, and that's just straight out of their playbook now. I hear that from industry all the time. All we want to do is drill in the southern tier. We won't go anyplace else. Yeah, you will. So, and by the way, just so you know, I have never been an activist in my life. I'm not an environmental, zealot. I actually come from an oil and gas family. My great-great-grandfather was one of the first wildcatters in the U.S. My mother's primary source of income is from oil and gas. I'm not here to bash the oil and gas business, but what I've seen in shale gas is wrong. So, just for what it's worth. Yes, sir.
What works to get this stopped before it starts? Is it taking it to court, or is it putting people in the street? What works to get this stopped?
Probably a little bit of everything, but I will tell you this right now, and I tell people this every place I go. If you go and try and fight this on the environmental merits of it, you will lose. You will lose. Because the oil and gas industry has been getting around environmental questions since day one. They know how to do it. They're hoping you will try and fight this on the environmental merits. However, if you turn around and you fight them with the economics, if you throw their own numbers back at them, they have no place to hide. And I've given you, I'll make all of this, I always make my presentations available, and I'll make the slides available, and I make a transcript available, because I work off a transcript, as you saw, because I throw out so many numbers and I don't want to make a mistake. So I make all that available always after my presentations. All of my presentations are available online, and you can pull them, and they're documented and so forth. But all of these numbers are their numbers. Ask them to justify those numbers. And then you will have a powerful argument. I promise you, you will. But they are hoping that you will go after this on the environmental note. Yes.
Just one thing. We feel here that we really have no power with our government, that they are not listening to anything, whether it be economics, and an example of that was that meeting that I was at the other day, passing out your invitations to your talk, and I just got blown off completely. They're not interested in hearing any arguments at all. So our plan here in New Brunswick is that we feel the only way to beat them is in the court system. So we have a legal action going, and it's on our website, noshalegasnb.ca. Anybody can contribute to the legal action. We need $500,000 to get it started. But when we do try taking them to court, I think, as you said, the thing to focus on would be the economic disadvantage of bringing shale gas into this province. And we would have our experts focus on that. If they're not going to listen to environmental concerns, then the economics would be the best. So that's
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir?
Well,
.org. You can do .com or .org. As far as Energy Policy Forum, there is so much information on there, and you know, if you go in and read things, I try and put the links to all the studies at the ends of the posts. But if you ever have any questions, just email me directly, and I'll try and direct you to the right place or whatever. But there is tons of information on there, and it's not just from me; it's from other people as well. And so it may be helpful to you. And thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much.